He thought it would be a routine patrol, but when the ranger noticed a massive rusted hatch deep in the forest, everything changed. Underground, he found something that had been hidden for nearly a century. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The morning began as many others had for Ranger Marcus Braden, yet something in the air told him the forest was different today. The storm that had raged during the night had torn through the high canopy like a fury unleashed, scattering broken limbs across narrow game trails and gouging deep scars into the soft earth. Marcus knew from years of patrolling the older sections of the national park that storms often revealed what time had hidden, and as he stepped onto the faintly steaming soil, he sensed the aftermath was more than the usual messy tangle of branches and debris. The forest smelled of wet bark and churned earth, rich and metallic, the kind of scent that hinted something had been disturbed deep beneath the surface. Marcus adjusted his pack, clicked his radio to check the signal, and began walking along his assigned patrol route, unaware that the day would mark the most unexpected discovery in the park's modern history. The trail was still slick from the rain, and his boots left deep impressions as he stepped over exposed roots and pockets of mud. Birds had not yet returned to their usual chatter. Only distant drips of water falling from leaves punctuated the silence. Marcus moved steadily, scanning the environment out of habit. Fallen trees forced him to reroute several times, and each detour carried him slightly deeper into a part of the forest where foot traffic was almost non-existent. Towering oaks and pines cloaked the landscape in heavy shade, their branches interwoven tightly enough to dim even the late morning sun. Yet, the deeper he walked, the more he noticed signs of the storm's intensity. Sections of the hillside had slid, and places where the soil had once been level now dipped dramatically. It was on one of these changed patches of land, in the middle of a half-collapsed bank of earth, that something caught his attention. It was only a faint flash of dull light, a reflection from a small patch of metal barely visible beneath a sheet of wet, brown soil. Marcus paused mid-step. There was no reason for any metallic object to be in this part of the park. Visitors seldom ventured here, and there were no service lines or old ranger stations anywhere nearby. His instinct sharpened as he moved closer, brushing aside fallen branches and clumps of moss with the back of his glove. The shape grew clearer, and his heartbeat began to quicken. The object wasn't just a piece of metal, it was curved, symmetrical, circular. As Marcus knelt, pushing away more mud, he realized he was staring at what appeared to be the surface of an enormous iron lid, as wide as a man was tall. Its edges were thick and crudely welded, the metal bubbled and rough in places where heat had once reshaped it. Reddish corrosion spread across its face like dried blood, and small streaks of exposed steel glinted faintly where the soil had been torn away. As he traced the outline with his fingertips, he found embedded bolts spaced evenly around the circumference. Old bolts, the kind manufactured decades before he was born. He brushed aside more grime and uncovered markings. At first, they appeared random. Tiny scratches, faint shapes barely distinguishable beneath the rust. But after clearing a larger area, the symbols seemed intentional, almost like coded identifiers. They didn't match any park equipment. They didn't match military tags he was familiar with either. Whoever made them had worked long before standardized systems became common. Marcus stood and circled the object carefully, noting how the ground around it had shifted. The recent slide had exposed about half of the circular lid. The other half remained partially buried, but it was clear that the object lay flat on the forest floor rather than being mounted into concrete or built into any form of constructed structure. It had been placed here, perhaps hurriedly, perhaps secretly, long before the forest grew thick and old. The idea didn't make sense. Who would lower something so heavy into a wilderness this remote, and for what purpose? The storm had peeled away years of earth and secrets. Marcus felt a ripple of unease, but also the spark of something he rarely experienced on routine patrols, genuine discovery. He backed up a few steps to survey the perimeter. The soil showed fresh fractures, the thinnest slices revealing darker layers just beneath the surface. The ground had shifted enough to expose the lid, but had also made the area unstable. Marcus knew better than to investigate further alone. He reached for his radio, steadying his voice as he relayed the location, description, and condition of the object. He emphasized the potential hazard of the ground and the unknown origin of the structure. The dispatcher responded quickly, informing him that a team would be assembled and deployed once his coordinates were confirmed. In the meantime, Marcus was ordered not to attempt opening the object or moving it. His job was to secure the area, maintain observation, and wait. As he clipped the radio back to his vest, Marcus walked several paces around the perimeter again, noting the heavy quiet of the forest. Rainwater pooled in shallow depressions. The hum of insects had not yet returned. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. He couldn't shake the sense that he was standing on the brink of something buried deeper than anyone expected. Perhaps something the storm had no intention of revealing before its violent intervention. Minutes passed slowly as he remained near the object, marking the edges with bright orange tape pulled from his pack. He felt compelled to study every detail, every scratch of rust, every faint symbol whose meaning was lost to time. He tried to imagine the labor required to haul such a massive lid into the woods a century ago. Teams of men, perhaps, machinery primitive by modern standards, an operation carried out at night, under lantern or torchlight to keep prying eyes away. The thought made his skin prickle. Whatever this lid concealed, it had been hidden deliberately, perhaps urgently. With the area as secure as he could make it alone, Marcus took a few steps back to a fallen log and sat, keeping the object within view. The minutes stretched longer. Eventually, faint mechanical noise drifted through the trees, the unmistakable growl of approaching engines. Reinforcement was on the way. As the vehicles came into sight through the forest, Marcus exhaled a breath he barely realized he was holding. The team was arriving, but the weight of the discovery still pressed against him. He felt as though he were a witness to history resurfacing. Even before the specialists stepped out of their trucks, even before they saw the rusted circle half emerging from the earth, Marcus knew the forest had surrendered something that was never meant to be disturbed. And whatever lay beneath that heavy, silent lid would carry echoes of a world long buried beneath soil, secrecy, and time. He stood, ready to guide the arriving team into the clearing, aware that this marked only the beginning of a story the forest had guarded for nearly a century. By the time the last of the utility vehicles rolled to a stop beneath the thick canopy of the forest, Marcus had already walked the perimeter several times, reviewing every angle of the strange metal lid to prepare himself for the questions he knew the arriving specialists would ask. The forest, disturbed earlier only by the faint sounds of distant engines, now stirred with the thrum of human activity. Doors slammed, voices murmured in low, controlled tones, and equipment clattered as it was unloaded onto the soggy earth. Yet, even with this sudden influx of people, the clearing maintained an oppressive stillness, as though the trees themselves were reserving judgment on the intrusion into a secret long and carefully kept. Several of the arriving personnel approached Marcus first. They asked for details about how he found the object, how much soil had shifted, whether there had been any movement or sounds since discovery. He answered calmly and precisely, but part of his attention remained fixed on the rusted circle embedded in the ground, the object that had lain undiscovered for generations until the storm tore open its shallow grave. Despite the number of people now surrounding it, the lid seemed somehow larger, more ominous than before, as if acknowledging that the time for isolation was over. The engineers and heavy equipment technicians examined the lid closely. One knelt with a portable sensor to assess the thickness of the metal. Another brushed away remaining dirt with gloved hands, tracing the outline of the lid and the recessed bolts hidden beneath layers of oxidation. A third examined the ground around the object, noting the instability the storm had created. They spoke in technical jargon, discussing weight distribution, structural integrity, and the safe angles at which their machinery could be positioned without risking further collapse of the surrounding soil. Their meticulousness made clear that they recognized this as no ordinary obstruction. A portable generator was started, its low growl filling the clearing as a floodlight was set up, casting stark illumination across the lid. Under this bright beam, the rust shimmered with shades of brown, orange, and gray, revealing pits, scratches, and the faint remnants of symbols carved decades earlier. The contrast between artificial light and the dense green of the forest made the object appear even more alien in its surroundings. It did not belong to the world of trees and roots, yet the forest had embraced it for nearly a century, burying it beneath layers of growth until the storm fractured the earth enough to expose its surface. Marcus watched as the technicians set up a winch system, anchoring the device to two thick trees standing several meters apart. Steel cables were unfurled, their ends fitted with heavy hooks. Meanwhile, another group prepared cutting torches, laying out hoses, regulators, and protective masks. They planned for both strategies simultaneously, unsure which would prove more effective against a metal structure of such age and thickness. The lead engineer approached Marcus again, asking for confirmation of the object's position and orientation when he first found it. Marcus explained that the lid had already been partially exposed by the landslide, and that he had not moved or disturbed it beyond brushing away the loose soil. The engineer nodded, satisfied, and returned to oversee the work. As the team began their initial attempt at loosening the lid, Marcus stepped back, watching from behind the designated safety line. The winch groaned as its motor engaged, the steel cables tightening with a hiss and then a taut, vibrating hum. The hooks latched onto the protruding sections of the lid, and the mechanical force began pulling upward. For long moments, nothing happened. The lid seemed fused to the earth, as if the soil itself resisted surrendering what lay beneath. The winch strained harder. The cables trembled, threatening to snap under the tension. The trees to which it was anchored creaked loudly as the force pressured their trunks. The device's operator eased back the throttle, then increased it again, testing the limits of the machinery. Still, the lid refused to budge. It was as though time had welded it shut, the rust forming a natural seal stronger than any man-made locking mechanism. When the winch reached its maximum tension, the engineer signaled to stop. The motor was cut, and the hum of the cables faded into silence. A murmur spread through the team. They regrouped quickly, acknowledging that the cutting torches would be necessary to weaken the grip the earth had on the ancient metal. As the torches were ignited, sharp blue flames hissed and spat, bathing the lid's edges in intense heat. The smell of burning rust and scorched metal filled the clearing, mixing with the lingering scent of damp soil. Sparks cascaded in bright showers, bouncing across the surface with fleeting brilliance before fading into dull flecks. The technicians worked slowly, cutting through the thick outer ring and loosening the tightly fused sections. Sweat beaded on their foreheads despite the coolness beneath the trees, and their gloved hands moved steadily, guided by experience and caution. The process lasted hours. The team rotated frequently to avoid exhaustion. Marcus remained on the sidelines, observing every stage, feeling the weight of each minute that passed as though the forest itself held its breath. The sun climbed higher, but little of its light reached the forest floor, which now pulsed with the artificial glow of halogens and the intermittent bursts from the torches. Finally, after the last section of reinforced edge had been weakened, the lead engineer nodded to the winch operator. The motor began again, the cables tightening with renewed fervor. This time, there was movement. At first, it was nearly imperceptible, a faint tremor that caused dust to trickle from the underside of the lid. But then, with a loud crack, the seal gave way. The lid lifted an inch, then two, the metal groaning as though awakening from a long, unwanted sleep. The winch continued pulling, and slowly, agonizingly, the enormous metal circle rose into the air. Soil clung to its underside, damp and clotted, dropping in clumps as it ascended. A dark void opened beneath it, wide and circular like the mouth of a tunnel leading into the depths of the earth. Cold air surged upward from below, brushing against Marcus's skin like a breath from another time. It smelled of age, of dust, of things left undisturbed in silence. When the lid was suspended several feet above the ground, the winch operator secured it. A temporary support frame was erected to hold it safely in place. The opening beneath it yawned like an abyss, its interior swallowed by darkness. Flashlights were aimed downward, revealing only a ladder of rusted metal rungs disappearing into a long shaft whose end could not be seen from above. The specialists conferred quickly. Gas sensors were lowered into the shaft to check for dangerous fumes. Moments later, the readings came back clear. A camera followed, sending up grainy footage of a chamber floor roughly 30 or 40 feet below. The surface looked flat, solid, and man-made, though the image flickered with distortions caused by the camera adjusting to the low light. It was clear that someone needed to go down. Marcus did not volunteer aloud, but he knew he would be a part of the first team. This discovery had begun with him. It felt only right to descend into whatever lay beneath. And when the lead investigator called his name, he simply nodded, already preparing himself mentally. Safety harnesses were secured to their bodies, and bright headlamps were clipped onto their helmets. Marcus approached the opening, looking down into the darkness. The cold draft still rose steadily from below, carrying with it subtle hints of metal, old wood, oil, and something else, something indescribably stale, as though time itself had settled heavily over everything beneath the forest floor. He placed his boot onto the first rung of the ladder. It held firm despite its age, a testament to the craftsmanship of whoever had built this place long ago. With slow, deliberate movements, Marcus began his descent. The metal was cool beneath his gloves, and each step felt strangely amplified in the tight, echoing shaft. Light from the surface faded quickly, replaced by the narrow beams cast from the lamps of the two team members following behind him. As he neared the bottom, the surrounding air grew colder still. His boot touched solid ground, a smooth, level surface covered with a thick layer of undisturbed dust. Marcus turned slowly, raising his headlamp. The light revealed the outline of a massive underground chamber carved directly from stone. The walls bore marks of chisels and rudimentary construction tools. Wooden beams, now darkened with age, supported parts of the ceiling. The floor, once carefully poured and leveled, showed faint imprints where footsteps had walked long ago, preserved like fossils beneath the still air. The others reached the ground behind him, their lights joining his to illuminate the cavern. Together they stood in awe, surrounded by a silence so complete it felt ancient. The chamber stretched far beyond the limits of their initial beams, but the faint glimmer of metal and the rigid outlines of crates and tables hinted at a larger, more organized space. Marcus exhaled slowly, the breath curling faintly in the cold air. He felt the pull of history in the depths of this hidden place. Whatever purpose this chamber had once served, whatever secrets had been entombed here by time and the will of those who built it, they were now within reach. And as he stepped forward into the darkness, guided only by the beams of their lights and the weight of the discovery ahead, Marcus understood that the forest had not merely revealed something buried, it had opened the first door into a long-forgotten world waiting to be uncovered. The air inside the underground chamber carried a weight that Marcus could almost feel on his skin, a heaviness born from years, perhaps nearly a century, of uninterrupted stillness. The dust on the floor muffled the sound of their boots, and even their voices, when used sparingly to coordinate movement, seemed swallowed by the vast interior. The chamber extended far beyond the reach of their initial beams, revealing only fragments at a time. A corner of a table, the edge of a wooden crate, the dim outline of shelving pressed against a stone wall. Nothing felt accidental. The room had the quiet order of a place that once served a clear, deliberate purpose, even if that purpose had been abandoned long ago. As Marcus adjusted his headlamp and took a few careful steps forward, his boots left distinct prints in the dust, overlaying traces of footprints far older. The light revealed the closest objects: a long table, its surface littered with brittle paper scraps and small metal components, an overturned stool with rust spreading across its legs, and behind it all, the unmistakable form of an old rifle propped against a crate as if waiting for its owner to return. Marcus moved toward it instinctively, aware that every detail mattered. The rifle's stock was dark with age, but intact, its barrel coated in a thin, even patina of rust. When he lifted it slightly, the weapon felt heavier than expected, as though time had soaked into its frame. Yet, underneath the oxidation, the craftsmanship was clear. This was no civilian hunting gun, but a weapon consistent with the early 20th century, built for precision and durability. The others fanned out behind him, their lights sweeping across the chamber in wider arcs. More rifles appeared, some leaning in corners, others laid neatly on shelves. None were modern, and their uniformity suggested that they belonged not to individuals, but to an organized group. A faint sense of unease brushed through Marcus. Whoever had once operated here had been armed, prepared, and professional, and they had vanished without disturbing the order of the place. He followed the line of shelving along the wall and spotted a series of wooden crates stacked with surprising symmetry. The stenciled papers once affixed to them had mostly rotted away, leaving behind faint outlines. When he pulled gently on one crate's lid, it resisted at first, then released with a soft crack. Inside lay rows of bullets wrapped in paper that had turned yellow and brittle with time. He lifted one carefully, noting its weight and shape. The casing was tarnished but intact, the tip blunt and unmistakably designed for the rifles scattered around the chamber. Some papers had handwritten notes, codes or initials, but the ink had faded too much to decipher. One of the technicians approached, shining his light directly into the open crate. He inhaled sharply, recognition flickering in his eyes. It didn't take a specialist to understand the significance. Ammunition preserved this well, deep underground and untouched for decades, was rare. Its storage conditions had been near perfect. Whoever set up this cache had intended it to last, perhaps to support a long-term operation or a contingency plan. Marcus felt a chill unrelated to the cold air. This wasn't a forgotten cellar or an accidental burial site. It was a base of operations, hidden far from roads and witnesses. Moving deeper, he encountered more personal items. A shelf held several leather jackets stiff with age, their collars cracked and their lining worn thin. Some carried hand-stitched initials. Beside them hung belts fitted with holsters, the leather dried to the hardness of wood. On a nearby table rested a set of knives with custom grips, some plain, others carved with ornate patterns. Marcus slid a finger across one of the blades. Though dulled by time, it still felt dangerous. The room was a preserved portrait of the people who once worked here, organized, skilled, and accustomed to violence. Across from the weapons sat a different type of evidence. Empty bottles, their labels faded, but readable enough to confirm what the team had suspected from the moment they saw the layout. The bottles had once contained whiskey from distilleries known to operate illegally during the Prohibition era. Some were stamped with markings that Marcus recognized from stories told by old historians, codes used to identify batches intended for smuggling routes rather than legal sale. Wooden crates beside the bottles bore similar markings, though most were now illegible. When Marcus stepped around them, he noticed the faint smell of old alcohol still clinging to the wood, preserved in the stagnant air. The forest above them had forgotten this place, but the chamber had retained every last whisper of its past. As he advanced further, the chamber widened into a second section, where more tables had been arranged in workspaces. Scattered across them were tools, maps, scraps of paper, an old lantern that had fallen on its side and cracked at the base, and several metal tins that once held gun oil. Everything had been left in such a way that Marcus could almost imagine the men who had occupied this place moving about, cleaning weapons, planning routes, counting supplies. The abrupt stillness of the room suggested a sudden departure. Nothing had been packed. No attempt had been made to hide tracks. The tools were exactly where hands had last placed them. He paused, absorbing the atmosphere, the invisible history that pressed on him from all sides. This room told a story without words. It told of preparation and routine, of people who planned meticulously and lived in the shadows of the law. And it spoke of an end. An unexpected, rapid end that had forced everyone to leave so quickly they abandoned everything. A flashlight beam caught the edge of something metallic behind more crates. Marcus approached, pushing aside a stack of wooden boxes to reveal another stash of weapons. Revolvers of varying calibers, many in holsters that draped across them like worn skins. Some were lined neatly in rows, while others appeared hastily tossed. Several belt-fed guns also lay there, heavy and imposing despite the erosion. The sheer volume of weaponry made his pulse quicken. This was not the hidden outpost of a small group. This was the armory of a large, coordinated syndicate, well prepared for conflict. He turned to the others, who were now making similar discoveries throughout the chamber. Their collective silence carried the unspoken realization that the base they had stumbled upon was far greater than any of them had expected. It wasn't merely a storage room for contraband or stolen goods. It was an operational headquarters, strategically located, carefully constructed, and completely concealed. As Marcus moved toward the far corner, something different caught his attention. A wooden board affixed to the stone wall. He approached slowly. The board held a large, hand-drawn map, its edges curled, its surface cracked, but still mostly intact. Even before reaching it, Marcus sensed its importance. When he leaned in with his headlamp, the details became clear. The map depicted the region surrounding the park, but with roads and trails that no longer existed in the same form. Faded lines marked secret routes, many of them weaving through forested areas or old, now abandoned logging paths. Symbols indicated hidden drop points, rendezvous areas, and transfer zones where contraband could be shifted from one vehicle to another. But what caught his attention most were the markings further south and west of the park. Tiny triangles and circles noted beside illustrations of mountains. These weren't natural features alone. They corresponded to a network of caves, some of which Marcus recognized. A few of those caves had been closed decades earlier due to safety concerns. Others weren't commonly known, even to regular park staff. The map was a blueprint for illegal transport created by people who knew the land intimately and exploited its most secluded parts. One of the investigators joined Marcus, studying the map with narrowed eyes. What they saw confirmed their growing suspicion. This wasn't simply a hideout for thieves or smugglers. The precision of the routes, the concentration of weaponry, the scale of supplies, all of it pointed toward a fully operational organization, one that must have coordinated multiple teams and managed substantial resources. And all of it had been buried under the earth, untouched until now. Feeling a swell of tension in his chest, Marcus took a step back from the map. It was as if the room was speaking to him directly now, revealing each layer of its past one piece at a time. The rifles, the ammunition, the alcohol, the clothing, the tools, and now the routes. They formed a cohesive picture. A picture of a group that had existed entirely in the shadows, whose life had revolved around secrecy, smuggling, and violence. He continued deeper still, further into the chamber. At the far end, dimly visible through the haze of dust and shadow, another section appeared. Sturdy metal shelves lined this area, though many had buckled under the weight of time. On them rested larger wooden containers, some sealed, others partially open. Marcus approached one of the open ones and lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of documents, ledgers filled with large lupin writing. Names, dates, quantities, and figures filled the pages. He could see records of shipments, earnings, material expenses, and coded entries that clearly referred to covert transactions. As he leafed through the aged pages gently, taking care not to damage them, he felt as if he were holding the very heartbeat of the organization that once thrived here. There was no doubt anymore. Marcus and the others had uncovered a fully developed underground base used by armed criminals during the early 20th century. It was a relic of the Prohibition era, preserved with eerie precision by the constant dry air and layers of earth above. Whatever had caused the group to abandon the location, they had left without warning, and left behind an entire operation frozen in time. Marcus straightened, the weight of the discovery heavy on him. The chamber around him suddenly seemed larger, more alive with unspoken memories. The objects they had found were not inert relics. They were fragments of lives once lived and choices once made. He wondered where the men who had used this place had gone. Had they escaped, been arrested, killed? Had they known, when they fled, that everything they had built would lie untouched for the next century, hidden beneath the roots of a forest that would eventually forget them. His thoughts were interrupted by a call from one of the investigators further inside the chamber. The man's voice held urgency, not fear, but intrigue. Marcus followed the voice until he reached another doorway carved into the stone. Beyond it was a narrower passage leading deeper underground. The air coming from within felt even colder, untouched by any trace of warmth. As Marcus stepped inside, his headlamp cut through the darkness, revealing stacks of crates even larger than the ones behind them. And in the far corner, half concealed in shadow, loomed a structure that made Marcus stop in his tracks. A massive metal door, its surface reinforced and fitted with thick locking mechanisms, stood silently against the stone wall. The sight of it sent a ripple through the group. It was not a mere supply closet or a storage unit. It was stronger, heavier, designed to protect something valuable. The kind of door only used for safes, vaults, or storage of extraordinary importance. Marcus approached it slowly, the cold metal reflecting the small circle of light cast from his lamp. Every instinct told him that whatever lay beyond this door would reveal even more about why this underground base had existed and why it had been abandoned. He exhaled, realizing the weight of the moment. The chamber they had explored so far had laid out the tools, weapons, and habits of the past occupants. But behind this reinforced door, he sensed, lay the heart of the story. And as he stood there, fingers brushing the cold metal handle, the past felt closer than ever, close enough to reach out of the shadows and speak its truth at last. The reinforced door stood like a silent sentinel at the very back of the underground passage, its steel surface dulled by age but unbowed by time. Marcus lingered in front of it, the beam of his headlamp tracing the contours of thick rivets and deep grooves that formed its outer frame. The air around it felt different, colder and almost motionless, as if the chamber beyond had been sealed so completely that the passage of years could not penetrate it. Everything they had seen in the main room had been revealing: rifles, ammunition, clothing, old work tables, maps, and the lingering scent of a bygone era. But this door carried a weight that none of the others had possessed. It seemed to promise answers, perhaps even the final truth behind why this underground base had existed and what its long-vanished occupants had feared might someday be uncovered. The other investigators approached as Marcus stepped back to give them space. Word of the discovery had already traveled through the chamber behind them, and the team gathered in a loose semicircle, their lights converging on the massive steel barrier. The lead specialist knelt in front of the lock, a deep cylindrical mechanism embedded in the door. He examined it in silence for several minutes, brushing off flakes of rust and peering into the narrow keyway. It was an antique design, more common in early-century vaults than in any civilian setting. A lock like this had been built not merely to delay entry, but to withstand force, tampering, and time itself. As the specialist prepared his tools, Marcus used the moment to breathe in the atmosphere of the room. The passage was narrower than the main chamber, and the walls were carved with the same unmistakable marks: chisels, pickaxes, and labor born from human hands, not machines. The ceilings were supported by timber beams that looked surprisingly sturdy. Even after so many decades, there were few signs of collapse. Whoever built this place had constructed it with a level of commitment far beyond makeshift shelter or temporary hiding space. They had intended it to last. The map Marcus had examined earlier lingered in his thoughts, especially the routes woven through the wilderness above. Those markings had revealed a network of movement and strategy that had spanned miles. They showed escapes, drop points, supply routes, but nothing on that map hinted at this part of the underground complex. no sign suggested the existence of a vault. If the map had been designed to coordinate operations, then perhaps the vault had been something separate, something kept secret even from many of the men who worked here. The lock yielded slowly, reluctantly. The specialist alternated between delicate instrument work and more forceful leverage. Every few minutes he paused, letting the metal cool from friction. Marcus watched him patiently, listening to the scraping, clicking, and gentle taps echo through the narrow passage. Time stretched, punctuated only by the mechanical rhythm of the tools and the soft murmurs exchanged between team members. At last, a sound emerged that was unmistakable, a deep, grinding shift within the mechanism. It was the sound of old tumblers aligning for the first time in nearly a century. The specialist leaned back, motioning for help. 2 more men joined him, gripping the door's large steel handle. With a coordinated pull, they tried to budge it. At first it resisted, as though fused to its frame by rust and the sheer weight of years. But slowly, inch by inch, the door began to move. A low roar of friction filled the chamber as the seal broke, releasing a faint draft of air so cold that it felt like stepping into a different season. The door opened fully at last, revealing a small but heavily fortified room beyond. Marcus stepped inside with the others, his lamp illuminating the sparsely arranged interior. The room was rectangular, with smooth walls that bore no markings except the traces left by tools during construction. There were no windows, no vents, nothing to suggest any point of access beyond the door they had just opened. It was a vault in the truest sense. In the center of the room sat a large wooden table, remarkably intact. On it lay 2 metal containers and a scattering of documents. Against the back wall, however, rested the object that instantly commanded attention, a massive iron safe. Its surface, though dulled, had resisted corrosion better than anything in the outer chambers. Deep-set hinges framed the door, and a large dial still sat at its center, though the numbers were nearly worn away. Marcus approached the table first. The documents, though yellowed and fragile, were clearly ledgers. He recognized the Lupin handwriting, similar to what they had found earlier in the larger crates, records of shipments, payments, and coded notations. Some papers bore dates from the early 1920s, others from the later years of the decade. The ledgers detailed transactions involving quantities of alcohol, firearms, fuel, and other supplies. Even without decoding the shorthand, it was evident these were the financial backbone of a major illegal operation. One document referenced costs associated with routes in the southern caves, which made Marcus's thoughts jump back to the map they had discovered earlier. The caves, marked with symbols, had not been random hiding spots. They were integral parts of a distribution network as carefully planned as any legitimate enterprise of the era. He turned his attention next to the metal containers. One held small, brittle envelopes filled with what appeared to be ration stamps, perhaps used to acquire goods discreetly. The other held several photographs, different from the group shots in the outer chamber. These were posed portraits, likely of the men who had run the operation. Hard faces stared at the camera, each man wearing the rough attire of workers or drivers, though their hardened expressions and confident stances spoke of roles far more dangerous than they appeared. Marcus studied them, wondering how many of these men had vanished into the folds of history, their names never recorded in any legal archive, their stories never told except through what he was seeing now. Finally, he approached the safe. The others gathered behind him as the lead specialist assessed the dial. It too was locked, but unlike the door, this mechanism was far more intricate. It was a true vault safe, meant to store currency or valuables with heavy security. The specialist retrieved his tools again, beginning the meticulous process of manipulating the dial, listening to the internal tumblers with practiced concentration. Minutes passed, then half an hour. The silence inside the vault room was suffocating, broken only by the faint clicks within the safe and the occasional whisper between team members. Marcus found himself drawn back to the ledgers as he waited. He flipped gently through page after page. Some lists were itemized with rare precision. Others bore only cryptic notes. Transfer by Wednesday. Hold for arrival. North run delayed. One page toward the back appeared to be a crude attempt at a balance sheet. A sum was circled several times, the Lupin ink bold despite the faded paper. It was a large number, even by modern standards, and he realized that the figure matched the total that had been reported stolen in a notorious bank heist in the mid-1920s, a case that had never been solved. The click came like a gunshot in the silence. The specialist turned the dial slowly, then stepped back. With a grunt of effort, 2 team members pulled the heavy safe door open. A whiff of stale, cold air drifted out, as though the contents had been trapped in the dark for generations. Marcus stepped forward, heart steady, but expectations rising. He knew instinctively that this was the heart of the underground base, the secret the reinforced door had been designed to protect. Inside the safe were stacks of cloth sacks, each tied with twine. The material had darkened, frayed at the edges, but the shapes were unmistakable. Marcus reached carefully for the nearest sack and loosened the knot. The cloth spilled open, revealing bundles of banknotes. They were old, printed in styles no longer used, some bound with crumbling paper bands. Despite their age, the crispness of many notes remained. The dryness of the air in the vault had acted as a natural preservative, keeping them intact. Some stacks bore dates that aligned with the unsolved heist. Others were from years before or after. It wasn't merely a stash of emergency money. It was a treasure hoard built from the profits of years of smuggling, robbery, and illicit trade. Beneath the banknotes lay another layer of sacks. When Marcus opened the next, he found gold coins, dozens of them gleaming faintly under the beam of his flashlight. They were heavy, well worn from circulation, and each one carried dates from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some were American eagles, others foreign minted pieces that had likely come through smuggling routes. The sight was staggering. The value alone was immense, but the historical weight was even greater. This was wealth gathered through criminal enterprise and preserved flawlessly for nearly a century. Folded among the sacks were pages of newspapers, each fragment carefully stored. Marcus unfolded one delicately. The headline was stark: "Bank robbery leaves town in panic. Thieves vanish without trace." The article described a daylight robbery, multiple witnesses, gunfire exchanged on the street, and then a mysterious disappearance of the perpetrators. No evidence had ever been recovered. Authorities had suspected that the culprits might have fled into remote terrain, but no one had imagined that they had hidden their loot beneath the forest itself. Piece by piece, the picture came together. The underground complex was not just a storage site for contraband. It was the operational heart for a group of armed smugglers and thieves who had once defied federal agents and rival gangs alike. They had built this vault as their insurance, a place where wealth could accumulate untouched, and then something had forced them to abandon it. Something sudden, something final. They had left behind weapons, supplies, maps, money, everything necessary to run their empire. Whatever drove them out must have been so immediate that even this fortune was left behind. Marcus felt the weight of history settle over him again, heavier than before. The vault room was a tomb for a criminal world long dissolved, and he, along with the others, had become its accidental witness. With every artifact uncovered, every scrap of evidence examined, the story grew clearer. The men who once ruled the shadows of the Prohibition era had vanished, leaving behind the remains of their rise and fall, and it had taken a single storm, nearly a century later, to unearth the truth. As Marcus stepped back, letting the investigators continue cataloging the contents, he cast one last glance around the vault. The air inside felt colder now, as if the room exhaled after relinquishing its buried secrets. The reinforced door remained open, exposing the heart of the mysterious operation to the modern world for the first time. They had uncovered the vault. But the implications of their discovery and the story it would unleash were only just beginning. The discovery of the vault changed the atmosphere in the underground complex in a way Marcus felt immediately. Until that moment, everything the team had uncovered — rifles, ammunition, clothing, maps, ledgers — had painted the outline of a forgotten world. But the safe, packed with sacks of money, gold coins, and newspaper clippings about crimes that had once terrified communities across several states, transformed that outline into a detailed portrait of a criminal empire that had operated with precision and confidence. The vault had not just preserved valuables, it had preserved the truth. And now that truth spread through every corridor, every stone wall, as if the complex itself had been waiting decades to reveal its story. While the investigators continued documenting the contents of the vault, Marcus walked through the main chamber again, revisiting everything they had seen earlier in light of the new revelations. The rifles no longer seemed like remnants of scattered skirmishes or amateur smuggling operations. Their uniform arrangement, their quality, and their number now pointed clearly to a heavily armed group prepared to defend their operations with deadly force. The crates of ammunition made sense, too, in far greater context now. They weren't reserves for emergencies. They had been supplies for a long-term operation, perhaps even a plan to expand routes deeper into surrounding regions. The abandoned tools and scattered notes on the tables were likewise imbued with new meaning. The final, hurried traces left behind when this organization was forced to flee faster than they ever expected. Marcus paused near the shelving that held the tattered jackets and belts. He imagined the men who once wore them moving through these rooms. He could almost picture them sitting at the tables late at night, counting profits or planning the next shipment, smoke from oil lanterns clouding the room. He imagined the tension that might have filled the chamber after a successful robbery or a near capture. Now, those same jackets hung motionless, their owners long gone, their stories entombed until the storm exposed their hidden world. A voice from the vault called Marcus's attention back. The investigators were preparing to carefully remove the sacks of money and gold from the safe, placing them in protective evidence containers. Marcus stepped toward the vault again, observing how methodically the team worked. Nothing was rushed. Every movement was measured. Every piece was examined, photographed, and sealed. The operation had become far more than documentation. It felt like extraction, almost an archaeological procedure performed on a criminal civilization that had existed beneath the feet of unsuspecting generations. Marcus approached the newspaper fragments lying on the table. Several clippings chronicled crimes from the same decade: robberies, shootouts, smuggling raids, Headlines spoke of masked gangs, ambushed convoys, stolen government shipments, and fugitives who had vanished without a trace. Many of the articles suggested law enforcement was convinced the perpetrators were receiving help from someone with intimate knowledge of rural terrain. Reading the articles now, knowing what lay beneath this forest, Marcus felt a strange mixture of awe and disbelief. The clues had always been there, embedded in history, but no one had pieced them together, because no one had ever imagined the existence of this underground fortress. He examined a clipping with special interest. It documented a heist from the mid-1920s that national newspapers had covered widely. The robbery had taken place in broad daylight, a brazen attack in a busy town square. Witnesses reported hearing gunfire as the thieves fled, leaving chaos behind. Marcus remembered the associated figure from the ledger he had studied earlier. The large sum circled repeatedly. Now, holding the clipping in his hand, he realized that the sum in the safe matched the reported total from the very heist. The criminals must have brought the stolen money here immediately, treating this vault as the safest location in their network. The realization led to another. If these men had fled suddenly, abandoning this treasure, then something catastrophic must have occurred. No organized gang would willingly leave behind such wealth, especially in the Prohibition era when their operations depended on liquid assets. The abruptness of their departure echoed throughout the chamber. Tools had been dropped mid-task. Ledgers lay open, not closed and stored. Weapons remained in open crates. Even the maps, so meticulously drawn, had been left on the wall rather than taken or destroyed. Whatever forced their hand had been swift and decisive. Marcus moved toward the far wall, where the large map still hung. He studied it again, this time tracing routes with newfound clarity. The paths that branched outward from the forest intersected with towns and rural outposts that the newspaper clippings had mentioned. The network had been efficient, dangerously so, cutting through areas that would have allowed the gang to move goods undetected for long stretches. It was a map of avoidance, a map designed to keep them ahead of law enforcement at every turn. One particular route made Marcus pause. It led to a cluster of caves marked with small symbols. He remembered the investigators' earlier comments. Many of those caves had since been sealed or were inaccessible. But in the 1920s, they had served as waypoints, places to hide contraband or regroup. Something about those symbols pulled at Marcus's thoughts. If the caves had been the part of an escape route, did the men flee into them? Did they vanish into the deeper tunnel systems that only experienced smugglers knew how to navigate? Marcus stepped back, the weight of the moment pressing on him. He realized how much this single discovery could change modern understanding of the Prohibition era and the criminal networks that flourished during those lawless years. For decades, scholars, historians, and law enforcement agencies had speculated about the disappearance of several notorious gangs. Many theories had circulated. Betrayal from within, conflict with rival groups, deadly shootouts, secret alliances gone wrong. But none of those theories had accounted for the existence of a sophisticated underground stronghold like the one he now stood inside. The sound of shifting equipment drew Marcus's attention toward the vault again. The investigators were preparing to open a second compartment inside the safe, one they had only just discovered. Unlike the main storage compartment where the sacks of money and coins had been kept, this smaller section was tucked behind a partition, its opening almost invisible unless the light hit it at precisely the right angle. The specialist had noticed the faint outline of a hinge and set to work on it. Marcus approached quietly, sensing that this new space might hold something even more significant than the money. When the small door finally opened, a faint metallic click echoed through the vault room. Inside the hidden compartment were a series of documents bound together with twine. The paper was thick, official-looking, and surprisingly well preserved. The top sheet bore a seal, faded now but clearly governmental. The investigators exchanged glances, suddenly alert. Marcus leaned closer as one of them gently unfolded the first page. It appeared to be a form of correspondence, letters between an unnamed official and a recipient whose identity had been removed or never included. The language was formal, containing references to shipments, investigations, and movements that were meant to remain confidential. As the pages turned, the content grew more concerning. It described incidents in which government shipments of goods had been intercepted by unknown groups, and details that suggested someone within law enforcement might have been feeding information to the very criminals they were supposed to apprehend. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold vault air. A hidden compartment inside a criminal safe, filled with correspondences that suggested collusion at higher levels, meant that this gang hadn't merely eluded federal agents through cunning and secrecy. They may have been aided by someone who benefited from their success. It explained why the gang had remained unstoppable for so long. Their secrecy had not been their only shield. They had been protected by corruption from above. If this part of the vault had been concealed more carefully than the money, perhaps it had been intended to serve as leverage. Insurance. A way to keep powerful individuals from turning on the gang. But whatever their intention, the documents had remained locked away and forgotten, their threat neutralized by time alone. Marcus let the investigators continue analyzing the documents and turned his attention back to the main chamber. His gaze swept across the tables, crates, shelves, and scattered remnants. The gravity of what they had uncovered weighed on him more heavily with each passing minute. He had expected to find something unusual when the storm revealed the lid, but he had never imagined uncovering the core of a forgotten criminal syndicate that had operated on a scale far greater than history ever recorded. He moved toward the entrance of the vault room, pausing once more to absorb the scene. The vault door stood open now, swinging slightly with the faintest breath of air. Through it, he could see the chamber filled with relics of crime, ambition, and desperation. Every item had been carefully placed, used by men who had believed they were untouchable. And in a way, they had been. No law enforcement agency had ever found them. They had disappeared on their own terms, leaving behind a meticulously ordered universe that only time could break. Marcus stood there, realizing how the story now fit together. The underground base was more than a hideout. It was a legacy of decisions, risks, and secrecy. The money in the safe wasn't merely loot. It was the accumulated result of years of criminal enterprise. The weapons weren't for intimidation. They were tools for protection and control. The map wasn't merely a guide. It was the blueprint of an empire carved through remote wilderness. History had tried to bury them. The forest had succeeded for a time, but the storm had undone the concealment. And now, for the first time, someone understood the full extent of what this group had built, and what they had lost. Marcus stepped back toward the main chamber, knowing that after this night, nothing in the park, nothing in the history books, and nothing about the men who once ruled these tunnels would remain the same. Their story had resurfaced at last, their silent voices echoing across time, and he stood at the threshold of that resurrection, aware that the implications were only beginning to unfold. The vault had surrendered its secrets, and for a long moment after the final document was lifted from its hidden compartment, an almost reverent silence settled over the underground chamber. The investigators stood in a loose circle around the open safe, their lights reflecting off the stacks of money and the golden glint of coins, while Marcus remained just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust again to the dimness beyond. He felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a realization that they had crossed a threshold. What lay beneath the forest was no longer a curiosity or an isolated relic of forgotten criminals. It was evidence on a scale that demanded attention far beyond the confines of the park, and the world above would not remain quiet for long. They spent the next several hours cataloging the vault's contents, but news traveled faster than the pace of their work. By the time Marcus and the others climbed back up the ladder to the surface, the clearing had transformed. Additional vehicles lined the narrow dirt road leading into the woods. Temporary floodlights illuminated the area around the massive metal lid suspended by the winch. Uniformed officers from the state agency stood among federal agents who had arrived faster than Marcus would have believed possible, speaking in firm but hushed tones as they assessed the scene. Portable fencing had been erected in a rough perimeter, and a handful of armed guards had already posted themselves at key points to keep any unauthorized individuals from approaching. The forest, previously quiet and still, now buzzed with the coordinated movement and clipped voices. Equipment cases were stacked in organized sections, generators hummed steadily, and a long table held laptops connected to portable scanning devices. Marcus recognized the shift immediately. This was no longer a discovery site, but an active federal crime scene. The artifacts below were evidence. Every scrap of paper, every weapon, every coin and banknote, a crucial piece of a puzzle that agencies had tried and failed to solve for almost a century. The lead federal agent greeted Marcus with professional calm, though his eyes betrayed both tension and fascination. Marcus recounted everything he and the initial team had found, describing the vault in detail, the ledgers, the maps, the hidden compartment, and the delicate condition of the documents suggesting corruption within long-defunct agencies. The agent listened without interrupting, nodding periodically, his expression growing more severe as the story unfolded. When Marcus finished, the man exhaled through his nose as if realizing the magnitude of what lay beneath them. "This is bigger than anyone could have guessed," the agent said quietly, more to himself than to Marcus. Marcus agreed silently. The clearing around them felt charged, as if the forest were struggling to absorb the sudden invasion of light, voices, and purpose. Only hours before, this place had existed in isolation, marked only by a rusted lid barely visible under the earth. Now it was connected to the present again, tied to modern institutions and technologies that would spread its story far beyond the tree line. Historians arrived next, summoned from universities and museums as soon as the federal report flagged the discovery as historically significant. Some arrived still in travel clothes, their eyes widening at the sight of the massive lid suspended in the air. Marcus had never seen seasoned academics look so shaken. When they descended into the chamber under supervision, many emerged pale and speechless, gripping notebooks filled less with interpretations and more with raw impressions. Several could barely articulate their reactions, muttering phrases like unprecedented preservation and a criminal time capsule beyond anything recorded. Journalists were not far behind. Word had leaked, perhaps from someone who had been unable to contain the scale of the discovery, or perhaps because news of such magnitude had a way of breaking free no matter how carefully officials tried to contain it. By the second day, a cluster of vans marked with media logos waited at a checkpoint several hundred feet from the clearing. Reporters, held back by stern officers, called out questions that mixed curiosity and urgency. Marcus heard his name once or twice, shouted by someone who seemed to know he had been the first ranger on the scene. He did not answer. He remained near the perimeter with fellow rangers, assisting federal personnel with site maintenance, ensuring no one strayed into restricted zones. Still, the questions carried across the trees like echoes. What had they found? Was it connected to real crimes? How old was it? Who had used it? Were there more tunnels? Were there bodies? Had anyone tried to hide it? Rumor spilled into the forest like a second storm. At night, the floodlights bathed the clearing in bright, cold illumination. Shadows cast by the massive, suspended lid stretched across the ground like the spokes of an enormous wheel. Marcus stood beneath them during his patrol shifts, feeling the surreal blend of modern urgency with the silent gravity of the past. Behind him, agents continued to descend into the chamber, their voices drifting up in faint, hollow murmurs. Teams of experts documented the weapons, scanning serial numbers and examining construction methods. Others photographed the ledgers and began digitizing their contents to cross-reference with historical archives. Each passing hour revealed new layers. The map, discovered in the main chamber, was examined by cartographers who noted that several marked routes corresponded precisely with unsolved smuggling trails mentioned in historical accounts. They found matching topographical features that had disappeared over time but had once been crucial escape channels. It became clear that the underground base had played a role in dozens of criminal enterprises once believed to be unrelated. The network had been hidden in plain sight, operating under the cover of wilderness and secrecy. Marcus watched as small discoveries accumulated into a larger narrative. The story of the gang became clearer. It had been no small-time operation but a powerful organization that moved goods efficiently, laundered profits through intermediaries, and leveraged inside information to evade law enforcement. Their activities had shaped regional criminal history, yet because of how thoroughly they had disappeared, they had become a footnote, until now. With each new finding, the footnote grew into a chapter that scholars and investigators eagerly pieced together. For Marcus, the process felt both surreal and deeply personal. He had begun the week expecting routine patrols, storm cleanup, and wildlife surveys. Instead, he stood at the center of one of the largest historical discoveries the region had ever known. And strangely, he felt a sense of responsibility. Not ownership, but stewardship. The forest had revealed its secret to him first. Now he watched as the world tried to interpret that revelation. When federal vehicles began arriving with evidence transport containers, Marcus knew the scope of the operation had shifted again. The vault's contents were prepared for relocation to a secure facility. Each sack of money, each gold coin, each document was sealed inside padded cases and cataloged with precise care. Marcus saw the worry on some agents' faces. They knew that the value of these artifacts, both monetary and historical, made them targets for theft. Yet the presence of armed guards and surveillance equipment gave the clearing an almost military atmosphere, something Marcus never thought he'd witness in the middle of the woods. During brief breaks, agents and historians spoke about the broader implications of the discovery. Some discussed how the documents could finally solve cases that had gone cold nearly a century ago. Others speculated that the underground complex could eventually become part of a museum exhibit or a protected heritage site. The idea that the forest itself might one day host guided tours through a restored portion of the chamber seemed strange to Marcus. He pictured visitors walking along the stone floors, observing carefully mounted exhibits illuminated by soft lighting, never sensing the raw tension he had felt when he first climbed down the ladder and saw the chamber stretching before him. He wondered what the men who had built this place would think if they could see the clearing now. Floodlit, swarming with officials surrounded by caution tape and cameras. Would they be startled that their work had survived the decades so completely? Angry that their secrets had been exposed? Or impressed that the forest, in its own inscrutable way, had safeguarded their legacy long after their disappearance? On the third day, a notable shift occurred. A press conference had been organized at a temporary stand several yards from the clearing. Officials announced that the discovery was connected to long unsolved criminal cases and confirmed the presence of significant historical artifacts. Though they refrained from sharing specific details, the statement drew an intense reaction from the media. Questions erupted like gunfire. Marcus listened from a distance as reporters pressed for answers. How extensive was the underground base? Were the criminals ever identified? Were they connected to famous robberies? Could the documents implicate government officials? Had any human remains been found? Officials remained cautious, but the broad admission was enough. The discovery would dominate national news for days, then weeks. The park itself became a focal point of attention. Overnight, interest in the region surged. People drove for hours hoping to glimpse the clearing, though the perimeter prevented anyone from approaching. Local businesses saw sudden increases in visitors. Online forums speculated wildly about conspiracies. Some claimed the gang had buried more treasure elsewhere. Others insisted the government would never reveal the whole story. The forest, once a place of quiet trails and wildlife observation, had become a symbol of a forgotten chapter in American history. Through it all, Marcus remained steady, guiding out-of-state agents through the terrain and answering procedural questions from rangers assigned to help secure the site. He tried to stay grounded, though the surreal nature of the situation never fully faded. At night, he lay awake in his small cabin on the edge of the park, hearing the hum of distant generators and thinking about the men who had once lived beneath the forest floor. He wondered what final moment had forced them to abandon everything. A shootout? A betrayal? A silent approach by federal agents? The reason lay somewhere in the record, buried in coded notes, hidden trails, and long-faded footprints. One afternoon, as Marcus stood at the edge of the clearing watching agents haul the final evidence containers toward waiting vehicles, the lead federal investigator approached him quietly. The man's usually stern expression had softened. "You know," he said, "without you finding that lid, none of this would have seen daylight. This entire piece of history would still be buried." Marcus nodded but said nothing. The investigator continued, "Discoveries like this don't happen often. You'll be part of every report, every document, every historical analysis. This is going to change more than you know." Marcus looked out over the clearing. The massive lid, now lowered back to the ground but no longer hidden, gleamed faintly under the lights. Beyond it, the forest swayed as if unaware of the transformation happening at its edge. The investigator walked away, leaving Marcus with the silence that followed his words. He stood there a long time, the breeze carrying the scent of pine and damp soil. The forest, patient and ancient, seemed to breathe around him. Beneath its floor, the underground chambers remained, stripped of their secrecy and filled with the echoes of a world that had reawakened. The truth had been uncovered. The story had finally risen to the surface, and as Marcus watched the clearing settle into a strange, almost peaceful stillness, he knew that the forest would remember this moment long after the lights were gone, the evidence removed, and the world moved on to its next story. But he also knew that a secret held for a century rarely fades quietly. It leaves marks, in history, in memory, and in the people who uncover it. He turned away from the clearing, ready to resume the quieter duties of his ranger life, but aware that he would never again walk the forest the same way. Beneath every step lay the weight of the past, now revealed, now known, and forever part of the land he protected. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who needs to see it, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from.